With me to Genesis chapter 39. We'll be reading verses 7 through 12, but first I want to give you the context. What's going on in chapter 39? First, we see in chapter 38 that it's the story of Judah and Tamar. We know obviously that the dirty and nitty-gritty details of Judah and Tamar, we're not going to go into that, but it leaves off after it's an inclusio from 36 to 38. Chapter 36 is the story of Joseph and how he was betrayed by his brothers. We see that in chapter 36. So now, after the story of Judah and Tamar, we come here, right smack in the middle of chapter 39, where Joseph is now entering Egypt. So, in verses 1, we see Joseph was taken to Egypt and taken down to Potiphar. And we know those were the Ishmaelites, because Joseph's brother, when they betrayed him, they sent him to the Ishmaelites. So, Potiphar was the captain of the bodyguard, a Secret Service captain, if you will. He was the head of the CIA, if you might put it in today's language. It says the Lord was with Joseph. So here he was being taken to be a servant of Potiphar. And the Lord was with Joseph, and as a result, he was given prosperity and success. The great thing about this is that Joseph rose up the ranks and became the head of the household. And as we see here, it was because of the Lord. The Lord is the one who caused him to rise up the ranks and become the head of the household and over the servants. So that's the context. So as we enter verse 7 here, oh, by the way, it says Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. It makes that verse, apparent right here in the first paragraph for a reason, because that's going to play a big part right here in our text. And as we read, it says, "It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great evil and sin against God?' So as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her, to lie beside her, or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work. None of the men of his household was there outside. She caught him by his garment, and saying, 'Lie with me.' And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside." So what we have here, essentially, is the temptation of Joseph by Potiphar's wife. Now, the structure here I see, and the one I've outlined, is first, the conception of the sin. That's the first point. The second would be the growing of the sin, or rather the temptation. And the third is the birth of the sin. So I'm kind of creating an illusion here. The structure is birth, or first the conception, and the growing within the womb, the birth pangs, and then the birth of the temptation. So that's how I would structure verses 7 through 12. 7 through 9 would be the conception. That's when essentially Potiphar's wife looks at Joseph. It says, looks at him with desire. That's lust. The first thing he sees is lust. Whereas the first thing she sees is him and his handsome body and his handsome face. And she's like, oh, I want him. I'm gonna chase after him. That's the desire that she had. So that goes down to verse 7 for verse 9. That's the conception, because as James says, that sin is conceived in the eyes. Now, verse 10, it says, "She spoke to Joseph day after day." Now, what does this mean, day after day? Well, basically, she's continually pursuing this man, this handsome young man who's probably 17 years old, because it says in Genesis chapter 36 that Joseph was betrayed at the age of 17. So, in between the time between him going from Israel, or the land where Jacob was, to Egypt, maybe less than a year. I don't think more of the time could have elapsed than that. So as a young man, obviously we know his hormones probably raging. And I'm sure we can all, relate to that, given that we're young men. And the temptations are going to be greater for Joseph, given that he's quite a young buck. Just put it that way. The question I think that we should consider, and the one I want to pose to you, is what was his motive? What exactly drove him to resist the temptation that was given to him. Because, I mean, as we've already said, Joseph is a young man, and temptations, I know, like sexual immorality is a giant stumbling stone for young men. It's just, what gives him the strength to overcome this? Well, I'm going to present two motives here. The first is that evil is great. It says in verse 9, "There is no one greater in his house than I, and he has withheld nothing from you. How then could I do this great evil?" So here we have a degree of evil. There's a hierarchy of evil, and the one that Potiphar's wife is Mrs. Potiphar, the one she's trying to tempt him with. It's a greater degree of evil here. So this is something that he feels the weight of that sin. He doesn't want to commit it. This is a sin against God. And moreover, we find in the New Testament that it's a sin against his own body as well. So the idea that the sin is so great, he doesn't want to do it, that's a motivation for him not to do it. The second motivation that he has is that he loved God more than he did the pleasure that would come from the temptation. Jonathan Edwards once wrote in Freedom of the Will that the will always do that which it's most pleased to do, right? I mean, if there's candy right here on the table and I was hungry, I would probably pick it up because my will will be pleased to do that. Now, in the same way, Joseph here, he was not pleased to fall into the temptation. The temptation, obviously, the pleasure that would result of the sinful act. But he found that the desire to love and follow God's command, God's will, overrided that desire to commit the act with Potiphar's wife. And therefore, because of that love, he decided not to and bolted out of that house. So those are the two motives, and I think that's the principal motive as to why Joseph decided not to commit that sin. And I think that has huge implications for us today, because now when we consider such temptations in college and outside the world, we have to be able to think, okay, how am I going to defend against these? Well, I need to love God more. I need to understand the great weight of that sin. So that's how we can defend against it. Now let me ask you a question. Was it a sin to be in the house? Was it a sin for Joseph to be in that house as she tried to elicit the act? No, of course not, because the principle of what Jesus says is that what goes into the body is not what causes man to sin, but what comes out. It's the issue of the heart. So the circumstances don't cause a sin at all. The circumstances are not sin. The circumstances cause the sin. So Joseph being in the household was not sin at all. So he didn't want to use the excuse that just because he's in the house he's not sinning, so therefore he can stay there. No, he didn't use that at all. He says, circumstances are going to cause me to sin, so I'm going to leave the house and bolt out of it, because I know that those circumstances are going to elicit a sinful desire and a sinful act. He heeded what was written what would be written in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 27, when Paul says, "Do not give the devil a foothold." The foothold, obviously, being something that probably best be translated an opportunity. Don't give the devil an opportunity. Don't stand there as Potiphar's wife is trying to elicit something from you. Bolt out the door. But was it a really dangerous sin is my question. That sin that he's about to commit, that Potiphar's wife is trying to elicit, is it dangerous? Well, let's look to the Old Testament. Proverbs 2:18, her tracks lead to death. Proverbs 5:5, her feet go down to death. Proverbs 6:27, she's a deadly fire and a pile of hot coals that scorches anyone that touches. Proverbs 7:27, her house is the way to Sheol, descending to the chambers of death. The one who follows her is like an ox on its way to the slaughter. Proverbs 22:14, the mouth of adulteress is a deep pit. He who is cursed of the Lord will fall into it. All throughout the Proverbs, just warnings. Stay away from adulteresses. It's Sheol. It's a path of destruction. It brought down kings. David and his son Solomon. Totally destroyed David, as we know. Whenever we think David, we think, oh, man after God's own heart, sure, but his now record has been stained with adultery. That is a huge, huge error. And it brings down kings and will bring down us if we don't guard against sin. 1 Peter 5, let me give you an example of why I think that sexual immorality is so dangerous. 1 Peter 5:9 says, resist the devil. Now he's talking about in that verse, 1 Peter 5:9, the roaring lion. He describes the devil as a roaring lion ready to devour people. In Ephesians 6:4 it says we're to struggle against the highest spiritual forces of evil, the principalities and such things. But then look at this. Watch this carefully. 1 Corinthians 6:18, when we're told to flee from sexual immorality. Wait, hold on a second. Let's go back. It says in 1 Peter 9, resist the devil. And it says in Ephesians 6:4, struggle against the highest principalities. Think about that. And then it says, no, flee from sexual immorality. Think about, see what the priority here is? Sexual immorality is a huge, huge temptation. And it's going to, every man of God is going to be tempted by it. You have to leave. You have to bolt out the door like Joseph. If Esau, you have to get rid of the temptation before it comes in. If Esau tries to come out the womb, let Jacob grab hold of his heel, exit the womb first, and obtain the birthright. That's an illustration of how we ought to get rid of sin before it comes out. We ought to grasp hold of Esau's heel and come out and receive